Hello, I'm David Morris. Welcome back to Risk, in which I'm reading from my book, A New Era of Risk, and also making some comments along the way. Now, if you've been listening to previous episodes, you will have heard me talk about the decline of trust, the decline of interdependence, really, and the move towards a more geopolitically contested world. These are all pretty obvious things that we can all see are going on in the world, but I want to drill down today in a little bit more detail into just what is interdependence. This idea that developed in the post-Cold War world, especially, where it was imagined that we would actually be able to trade and lower trade barriers, not raise them, and that we would be able to benefit ourselves from trade, and the people we were trading with could benefit. So, for example, for me as an Aussie, in the Australian case, Australia was able to develop significant trade with China. Australia selling China what China needed, iron ore and coal and lithium and other things. And in return, Australia was able to import very inexpensive manufactured goods that Australia needed, that it could not produce itself. So this was kind of mutually beneficial. And this was a classic example of the interdependence concept, but one that's very much out of favour now amongst all the geopolitical talk of declining trust, threats and risks, vulnerabilities. Wherever there's trade now with a country that has a different political system from ours, we're imagining that there are vulnerabilities. Now, of course, there are risks, and I want to pursue those as we move through my book. But today, let's talk about interdependence in a little bit more detail. Where does the idea come from? Well, the concept was developed by American academics John Keohane and Joseph Nye, and I'm going to read a little bit from my book here about the promise of interdependence with China. Whether the forms of international cooperation developed during the post-Cold War period of US global power would endure after a decline of US relative power was actually a central question posed in the development of interdependence theory by Keohane and Nye. And this has become a central dilemma now of our times. The concept of interdependence became a key tenet of liberal internationalism in international relations. Keohane's theory of interdependence was firmly based, nevertheless, on realist principles, widely applied in international relations, that states will seek to pursue their interests, however they are constituted and understood at the time. It is in interdependence, consistent with the pursuit of interests, according to Keohane, that it is possible to find sufficient common or complementary interests to generate international cooperation. Keohane's theory helps us to understand why most of the time those states existing under US global leadership have sought institutionalized patterns of cooperation through institutions and agreed rules, norms, and procedures for negotiation, what we used to call the rules-based order. And in that rules-based order, it was imagined that interdependence, even with very different countries, could work. That was the optimism of the post-Cold War period. Keohane's observation that states will seek to reduce uncertainty and risk and lower transaction costs of decision-making by sustaining forms of international cooperation depended, however, on an assessment of gains rather than losses from such action. Interdependence cannot therefore be equated with some idealistic sense of harmony, a term incidentally often used in China, as we'll discuss later. Keohane noted that harmony would be the perfect state in which one state's pursuit of its interests would facilitate the goals of other states without any negative externalities. Rather, in interdependence, which is much more realist, in interdependence, the pursuit of national interest leads to a never-ending negotiation and a process of adjustments, accommodation and coordination with others, in which the outcome is that each other's goals are pursued without conflict. It means there'll be compromises and there'll be risks. There'll need to be a constant process of management, including risk management. But the concept is that it's realistic and it has lower transaction costs to develop cooperation rather than conflict. Seems pretty basic. stuff, really, but it's really controversial these days to talk about interdependence as being the norm, and it's imagined that geopolitical contest and declining trust and risk and threats even are the norm. So it's worth us pursuing this question of interdependence, I think. So we might describe interdependence actually as diplomacy rather than conflict. Diplomacy in the broadest sense of the word, although it should not be understood as mutually exclusive from attending simultaneously to protection of national security. After all, every nation defends its national security, and so that's a given. Interdependence is, after all, constitutive with a wide range of risks that depend upon the geopolitical balance. Now, this is important. Two of Keohane's observations are particularly relevant to the discussion of interdependence with a rising China. First, Keohane noted that international cooperation is rarely universal, and that it may be more efficient amongst like-minded states that make and maintain rules and norms. On this factor, we might therefore expect interdependence between non-like-minded states to be problematical. Second, Keohane also observed that states with opaque decision-making, which restrict information about their preferences and likely future actions, will find it more difficult to make mutually beneficial agreements. China, of course, does not expose its decision-making to a US level of international scrutiny, and China's narratives of its likely future actions, which we'll discuss later, remain widely misunderstood or distrusted, which points to another potential problem here with interdependence. When leaders become convinced that they cannot trust each other to pursue positive sum outcomes, they may be understood to exhibit what is known as the prisoner's dilemma. Now, in the prisoner's dilemma, two guilty prisoners are questioned separately. Both know that if neither of them confess, the lack of evidence against them means that they may only be held for 30 days on a misdemeanor. If both confess, both will be sentenced to a year in prison. The prosecutor offers the option of confessing and walking away free if the other prisoner refuses to confess. In that case, the other prisoner will be imprisoned for 5 years. Now, on rational grounds, both are expected to confess and serve 1 year in prison to avoid the 5-year sentence, when it would have been optimal to have trusted each other and to have not confessed. Interdependence theory helps to explain why, after repeated plays, both players of the prisoner's dilemma game can nevertheless learn to achieve a mutually beneficial outcome through cooperation, through building trust, even though they might be criminals. Therefore, despite contemporary populist narratives of distrust and fear of the other, decision makers in the international system, which is far more complex than a two-player game, may tend to engage in cooperation in the course of what Keohane describes as constant bargaining and adjustment in the pursuit of mutual interests through interdependence, rather than the destructive alternative of confrontation and conflict. Although, to be sure, sometimes states do opt for confrontation and conflict, whether, as in a multi-play prisoner's dilemma, the world will become more trusting of China after repeated experience, and whether China can inspire cooperation with its new initiatives of global governance, is yet to be seen. Keohane's theoretical framework can be applied in understanding the deepening global interdependence, widely considered an unstoppable mega trend during the recent incarnation of world order from circa 1989 until circa 2020, a period that we call globalization. This period was also characterized by a brief and unique period of unipolar power in the international system for the US, featuring the retreat and ultimate collapse of its geopolitical competitor, the Soviet Union. The globalization trend saw accelerating international financial flows, the increasing integration of national economies into global value chains, the increasing integration, repeating myself here, technological transformation, notably information, in exponentially greater volumes and speed, and increased movement of people. All of these things happened together during the globalization period. In this post-Cold War world, greater economic security was widely understood to be achievable through international cooperation, and such economic security was expected to reduce the conditions that led to conflict, deepening a consensus of support for interdependence. The strong global growth of most of the period included particularly strong growth in the East Asian region as it became fully integrated into the global economy, and as its tiger and then its dragon economies became symbols of the economic and social benefits of export and investment-led growth. In the post-1989 Western discourse, however, liberal Western scholars commonly went further than Keohane's realism in conflating the globalization trend with political liberalization, the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama famously said, in which the world was normatively expected to embrace not only the market economy and free flows of trade and investment, but the world was also expected to embrace the values of liberal democracy. This narrative was problematical, even in its universalistic claims for newly liberated Eastern European countries determined to join the European Union and NATO, let alone further to the east. In the US, which found itself the predominant global power with unprecedented influence, it was expected that even China, despite its long history as a centralised authoritarian state, would democratise, following the apparently inevitable path beaten by other US-influenced, however, East Asian economies such as Japan, the Republic of Korea and Taiwan. Indeed, US observers were confident that China would remain a partial power and could be absorbed into the liberal international order. US liberal thought and elite opinion was driven by a confidence that China could be encouraged to be a responsible stakeholder through a combination of US coercive power and a reassurance of respect. Now, I have to say at this point that while it appears in the US there was this confidence that somehow China would become like a Western country, and also in Europe there seemed to be such a confidence that Eastern Europe was Westernizing and democratizing, that equally there was an expectation that somehow China would follow the same path. That values approach, that values prism really, that was brought to international relations, I don't believe was held here in Australia, where I worked as a diplomat. I don't recall any Australian diplomat or observer of the time saying we believe Asian countries are all going to westernise. That was never a belief here in the Asia Pacific, but it was a strongly held belief in the US and Europe, and I think explains their disillusionment later when in fact it became apparent that China was not going to westernise as it modernised. On the ground, the East Asian governance environment was more complex than the spread of electoral democracy in some states suggested, however. Although the more successful East Asian economies adopted often highly effective technocratic and meritocratic leadership development, which included elements of neoliberal economic theory and interdependence theory, this did not mean the liberal norms of Western governance were translated into the region. Rather, semi-authoritarian governance and traditional power structures remained the norm, rather than the exception across most of Asia. There was therefore a misdiagnosis at the heart of the rather optimistic conflation of globalization with political liberalization. Perhaps this was understandable, as the US was focused for most of the period on other regions of the world than Asia, and Europe was focused on its own political liberalization and stabilization experiment with the expansion of the European Union based on this values agenda. Indeed, the liberal theory appeared to fit the interests being pursued by the US and Europe, but it was not grounded in the dynamics at play in Asia. An important geoeconomic feature of this period, fundamental to understanding China's new trans-regional initiatives and often overlooked in the US and European literature, was the consolidation in the latter part of the 20th century of the East Asian state-driven and trade-focused development model, the agency and indeed innovation of leading Asian economies in seeking opportunities from interdependence, taking advantage of their comparative advantages to integrate into global value chains, became a driving factor in the globalization era. So here again, in the US and Europe, I think there was a misdiagnosis. I think there was a belief that globalization was all about Western values. Globalization in Asia was all about the pursuit of national interest. Now, I'll come back next time and we'll continue this discussion because it has many implications for the times that we're in, for all of us, including for businesses and others trying to understand the risks ahead.